This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for the 507th MTG Top 10. In this series, I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at World Enchantments. Over the years, I've taken a look at pretty much every single card type, subtype, and supertype, but I've never taken a look at World Enchantments. World is an enchantment supertype that is retired these days, and it has been for a very long time, with the last World Enchantments appearing in Visions, a set that came out in 1997. And while they did show up somewhat regularly in the early days of Magic, it was never in huge numbers, and there are only 26 World Enchantments in this entire game. So I think there are many players out there who probably don't even know they exist. Because they are so obscure, I will explain how this type of enchantment works. Within the game, they are not drastically different from a non-aura enchantment, with one big exception. There can only be one World Enchantment in play at a time. And if another one is played, the one that's on the battlefield already goes to the graveyard. Generally, World Enchantments also have symmetrical effects, which makes sense, since the idea is that the whole world has been changed, hence the whole battlefield for both players. As we go through this list, you'll also note that the cards have Enchant World on the type line, but this has since been errata to World Enchantment. While there are only 26 World Enchantments in the game, and we haven't seen a new one since 1997, they have had an impact on the game, and while most of their heydays are long past, there are even a few that have had long-term impacts on Magic. In this video, we'll cover the 10 World Enchantments that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first-tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and Mythic Championships, and a second-tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Grand Prix and Regional Championships. At number 10, it is Living Plane. This World Enchantment turns all lands into 1/1 creatures that are still lands. This can be useful if you need to do some damage, but more frequently players like to combo Living Plane with Destroy Creature effects so that they can also destroy all lands. Living Plane sees some play in Legacy Nick Fit decks. These are disruptive mid-range decks that run multiple ways to tutor up powerful singleton cards. Academy Rector allows the deck to tutor up enchantments, and some versions of the deck have a Curse sub-theme, and in those decks you can combine Living Plane and Curse of Death's Hold, which will result in all lands being destroyed. Not all Nick Fit decks utilize this Curse angle though, and that's why Living Plane only has a single point in Legacy so far. At number 9, it is Null Chamber. When this World Enchantment enters the battlefield, you and your opponent both choose a non-basic land card name, and those cards can't be played. Basically, it's a symmetrical Meddling Mage. Between 2008 and 2010, the Chamber was featured in the sideboard of Enchantress decks in Legacy. These decks utilized Argothian Enchantress and a whole bunch of enchantments to draw a lot of cards. Some of those enchantments would give you value every time you drew a card too, like Hoofprints of the Stag or Words of War, which could serve as your eventual win condition. Obviously, this deck was quite vulnerable to effects that destroyed all enchantments, and Null Chamber could be sided in to prevent those types of cards from being cast. Provided the Enchantress deck already had an Enchantress in play, there wasn't really a single card the opponent could name that would shut the deck down, so the fact it was symmetrical wasn't a huge issue. It hasn't gained any points since 2010. At number 8, it is Fairies Realm. During each player's upkeep, this World Enchantment makes that player choose between artifacts, creatures, lands, and non-aura enchantments. All the permanents that have that type then phase out. Note that this phasing out happens to all permanents of that type in play, not just the permanents of that type that player controls. Fairies Realm has been utilized off and on as a sideboard card in Legacy and Vintage combo decks. It can be pretty useful against decks utilizing Prison and Tax effects, since if you can phase out opposing Thorns of Amethyst or Chalices of the Void, you're going to be able to more easily go off with your combo. It has a point as recently as 2021, so it probably isn't done yet. At number 7, I have Elkin Lair. This world enchantment has a pretty cool design. During each player's upkeep, that player has to exile a card at random from their hand. Then they have until the end of their turn to play that card. If they don't, the card goes to the graveyard. It was played as a sideboard card at the Mirage Block Pro Tour, an event dominated by Bloom Drain decks, which ran only a single copy of Drain Life as their win condition. The deck needed to get its combo online and make a ton of mana and draw a bunch of cards so that the Drain Life would do the job. These decks really didn't like being forced into having to cast their combo pieces on a particular turn, as they often needed to cast them all in a single turn to really go off, so the Lair represented a real problem for them. Elkin Lair hasn't gained any points since 1997. At number 6, it is Hall of Gemstone. When this world enchantment is in play, each player chooses a color during their upkeep, and then all lands can produce only that color of mana. Again, this is symmetrical, so that means you can use this to fix your own mana to some extent, but it's more effective at hosing your opponent's mana base so they can't interact with you during your turn. It is another world enchantment that was used exclusively as a sideboard card. It showed up in recurring survival decks in Standard. These decks relied on tutoring up and reanimating combo pieces, making it very vulnerable to counter magic and interaction. The Hall could be brought in to keep an opposing player off of blue mana during your turn, so you didn't have to worry about that. It gained all of its points in the Standard of 1998. At number 5, it is Forsaken Wastes. If you're tired of playing against life gain decks, then this world enchantment is for you. It makes it so that players can't gain life, and each player also loses 1 life during their upkeep. This means it can represent a pretty significant clock all on its own. It also punishes a player for removing it by doing 5 to the player who targets it. It was a useful sideboard card for black aggro decks back in 1997 when Necropotence was all the rage in Standard. Those decks relied on being able to gain life back with Drain Life so they could keep drawing cards, but now that wasn't going to be an option for them, and their life total would never go up, making their life a lot harder. It was also utilized by some otherwise mono-red aggro decks during the time, as those decks are always happy to have a card that does direct damage to the opponent and turns off life gain. It also picked up a single point in the sideboard of an extended mono-red aggro deck. This was another format that involved Necropotence. That said, it hasn't gained any points since 2000. At number 4, it is In the Eye of Chaos. This world enchantment counters instants unless the player who casts that instant pays the mana for that card a second time. Obviously, this is really good at hosing instants, including counter magic, as it makes it much harder to efficiently utilize them. It even makes a player actually pay the mana for free counter spells like Force of Will, and it's also pretty useful against decks looking to abuse Omniscience. It's another world enchantment that is primarily used as a sideboard card, as obviously this effect is narrow enough that it isn't going to be useful against everybody. It has gained most of its points in Legacy Enchantress decks. In addition to being useful against free spells, it also does a pretty good job of hosing decks like Storm. It also has a single vintage point which came from an Oath of Druids deck that was running it in the sideboard for similar reasons. It hasn't gained any points since 2019, and it seems possible that it never will. There are just a lot of better prison and tax effects available in both Legacy and Vintage. It takes a very specific metagame to want to run In the Eye of Chaos over something like Trinisphere. At number 3, it is Nether Void. This is another world enchantment that counters spells, but it's much broader than In the Eye of Chaos. It makes it so all spells get countered unless the player casting that spell pays 3 mana. It's gained all of its points in Legacy Pox, a deck that looks to pick apart an opponent's mana base and hand using Smallpox and Sinkhole. If you can get your Nether Void in play, they aren't ever going to be able to pay the cost since they will be short on mana. While the effect is symmetrical, Pox decks get around this by utilizing cards like Cursed Scroll and Nether Spirit. You can use the scroll to slowly kill your defenseless opponent without casting any spells, and Nether Spirit can just come back from the graveyard and keep attacking. It doesn't get cast, so it doesn't get countered. Not all Pox decks go this route, but at least one Pox deck packing Nether Void top-8'd at least one major event every year between 2014 and 2021, and while it doesn't have a point yet in 2022, it has some time left to continue its streak. At number 2, it is Concordant Crossroads. This world enchantment gives all creatures haste. This isn't an effect that green usually has access to, and it gives it to you fairly efficiently. The Crossroads gained all of its points in Legacy Elf decks between 2011 and 2012. These decks look to cast Glimpse of Nature and then play a bunch of cheap elves to draw their entire library. The deck uses a variety of mana-producing elves to make it so you can keep chaining them together, and while some of them don't require your creatures to have haste to do their thing, like Heritage Druid, the deck also runs a ton of elves who can tap for a bunch of mana, like Elvish Archdruid and Priest of Titania. And if Crossroads is in play, you can tap them right away and just keep chaining your elves together. Eventually, elf decks power out something with all that mana that can win them the game. While elf decks are still a thing in Legacy, these days Concordant Crossroads isn't really utilized in them, and it has no points since 2012. And at number 1, we have what is probably the most famous world enchantment, and that's the Abyss. During each upkeep, the Abyss forces the player to choose a non-artifact creature, and the Abyss destroys that creature. This effect is of course symmetrical, but if your deck isn't really interested in playing creatures, you get to ignore it. So that means there are lots of decks who are at least potentially interested in this card. In Legacy, its points have come as a main deck card, and some decks we've already covered, including Enchantress and Pox. It pairs nicely with Enchantress especially, since most versions of that deck only run a single creature in Argothian Enchantress, and because it has Shroud, it can't actually be destroyed by the Abyss, so you get to ignore the effect for the most part, and your opponent doesn't. In Vintage, its points have all come as a sideboard card in Storm decks which don't tend to run any creatures. It looks like the Abyss is likely to stay as the number 1 card on this list for the foreseeable future, as it has a significant lead while also being the card on the list that's the most active today. So, those are the 10 world enchantments that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you're interested in enchanting the world, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the over 500 other MTG Top 10s I've already made, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.